Welcome to the first coding video of app design. In this video, we're going to cover the basics of HTML, and we're going to build a simple about page that will be a good scaffold for us as we start building our first application together. In the future videos, we'll talk about CSS, we'll talk about JavaScript, TypeScript, React. So we're going to add more complexity as we go, but we're starting off simply with just focusing on HTML. And before we start, one tip for following along with all of these app design demo videos is to actually watch the video twice. So the first time through, just focus on the concepts, take notes, make sure that you understand what we're doing. And then the second time through, you can watch it at 1.5 speed, 2x speed. You can pause and try and follow along. And the reason why you watch it twice is so that that first time you've really got a strong grasp of the concepts. So that when you do that second watching where you're following along, if you hit errors, you understand what you're trying to do, so you can debug more effectively. And even though this sounds like more work watching this twice, it actually ends up speeding up your workflow if you do this two-pronged approach where you focus on the concept first and then try and follow along. You will be able to debug much more effectively. Okay, that out of the way, let's dive into HTML. So we're going to be talking about hypertext markup language. And if we break this down, hypertext just means the fact that you have text which links to other text. So you go to Wikipedia and there are 15 links to other Wikipedia articles. That's the hypertext part. And then the markup language part is that we are annotating the text, the content that's on our page. So I've got two examples of some HTML down here. We've got a header, an H1 with about page. So you can see that we're annotating the text about page and telling the browser that this is a header of level 1. So we've got this opening tag and a closing tag surrounding this text. We've got a similar thing down here for a paragraph where we have some text of the paragraph, the content, that's surrounded by an opening paragraph tag and a closing paragraph tag. So we're annotating that content to tell the browser what type of content this is. And that will eventually change how this thing is represented when we open the page in our browser. So to get started, we are going to need Visual Studio Code installed. So you can download that to your machine, get it installed. And then I also want to show you, so I've got a little virtual machine here with a fresh install of Visual Studio. So if you open it up for the first time, your Visual Studio will look something like this. I want to show you what we need to do here to get this set up, because we need two plugins for getting started today. So if you go to the sidebar here, there are a couple of different views that you can open up, and one is the extensions view or window here. So I'm going to open this up and search for two packages. So Prettier is the first one. And if you click on that first link here, you should see something that looks like this. It is a code formatter that we're going to be using for HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So go ahead and install that. And you can see after it's done, it'll say it's installed globally. And then the other one we want is called Live Server. So if I search for Live Server here and go to this first one, it'll look something like this. This is essentially a little local server that we can start up inside of Visual Studio to then view our web page. So you want to go ahead and install that, and you'll see the same thing. Extension installed globally. If you're ever looking for more functionality to add to Visual Studio, the extensions tab here is a good way to search for things. Like if you're working in React and you want to see some plugins that are related to React, a library we'll be covering later, you can see a bunch that are in here, and you can install any of these. And then if you change the filter here to installed, you can see the ones that you have installed. So if you ever need to uninstall one that you've installed, you can just go ahead and click on it and then click the uninstall button. So I'm going to get rid of this window here. We no longer need that virtual machine. And what we're going to do is make sure that we have a folder where we're going to be working. So I have a folder for application design and week 1, class materials. I'm going to create a new folder in here called HTML demo. And then I am going to go ahead and grab a new Visual Studio Code window, and I am going to drag this folder into this window to open this folder in Visual Studio. So you can do this click and drag to open the folder. You can also go to File, Open Folder, and then select that folder from your machine. I'm just going to do the click and drag here. And once we've got this opened up here, you can see that there's a new area in our sidebar for Explorer that says HTML demo, matches the name of our folder here. So this is the folder view of our workspace. So we can, for instance, click this to add a new file. I'm going to add two in here, index.html and about.html. And if I go into my folder using File Explorer here, we can see that those two files were just created inside of that folder. So what you're seeing over here in the sidebar for HTML demo is our contents of our folder. And this is generally how we're going to work with Visual Studio, is we're going to go ahead and open a whole folder into our Visual Studio Code workspace so that we can work with all the contents of that folder inside of Visual Studio. We're not really going to be just opening up loose files. It's always going to be connected inside of a folder inside of Visual Studio. And then a little bit of navigation here with Visual Studio open. So if I close both of these files, I want to make sure that I am on this Explorer tab. You've got a few others depending on what extensions you have installed. So we've got our extensions tab. We've also got a find tab. We want to make sure we're on the Explorer tab here. If we have no files open and we click on one of these files, it is going to open a tab here where we can edit that file. And this tab is italicized here, which means that it is our current working file that we have open. And if we click on another file, it's going to switch what's open in this tab. So now we're seeing about.html. So if we want to make sure that we have both of these open simultaneously, one way to do that is when you open a file, you can double click on it, which it'll go from italicized to non-italicized. So now this is open permanently. So if we open something else, it's going to open up in a new tab. And if you have a tab that's open that you want to convert to sort of permanently open here, if you double click, it'll turn from italicized to non-italicized. So this is now open. So I've got both these files open. Inside of Visual Studio, a couple other things. This sidebar, if you move your cursor to the dividing area between the Explorer here and your tab, you can drag and close your sidebar for more real estate. You can drag it open more to see more of your files. You can also grab your tabs, and if you wanted to open them side by side, you can totally do that. If you wanted to open them so that you've got two tabs top and bottom, you can do that. It's just a matter of clicking and dragging those tabs. All right, so we're going to get started in our about.html file, and we're going to add our first HTML elements that are going to look like what we saw on the whiteboard. So we'll add an H1, which is a header of level importance 1. And Visual Studio, you can see as soon as I completed that opening tag, the closing tag was automatically added for me here. So what I'm going to do here is put some text inside of this opening and closing tag. And I'm going to create another one that has my name in it. So this is now a header of level importance 2, an H2. And let's add a paragraph in here that says, we're learning HTML together. Give that a save. And one thing that I should mention as we're going, you usually want to save your files. If you're unfamiliar with Visual Studio, anytime you make a change to your file, you can see that there are unsaved changes because there's a little circle that's added here and here to let you know. Control S is the hotkey on Windows to save your file. And let's add a couple other ones here. So a couple other HTML elements. I'm going to type in HR and then hit tab. So this is another way that you can add elements to the page using Emmet inside of Visual Studio. That comes as part of the Visual Studio install. So if you ever type in the name of a tag and hit tab, it will fill out that whole element for you. So I'm adding an HR here. And then let's also go ahead and type an M tag here and put together inside of that tag. Okay, so we've got our HTML file. It has some information in it. It has a header, something called a horizontal rule, a header of level 2, a paragraph with this emphasis tag in here, and we'll unpack what these are in a second. Now that we've got it written, though, we want to open it and see what it looks like in the browser. There are a couple ways to do this. The first way that we're going to do this is the way that we're really not going to do it in the future, but I want you to be aware that you can do this. So I'm going to right-click over here, and I'm going to reveal in File Explorer. And so that's going to take me to where that file is on my machine. So my about.html. I could double-click on this, and it'll open in Chrome on my machine. It'll open in whatever your default is on your machine. And now you'll see this Chrome tab with your file loaded. You can see it in the URL bar. It's got the full path to where that file is located. About.html is at the end here. And we've got some stuff showing up on the page, which is great. It doesn't look great. We'll get to improving it, but we can actually see something on the page. So this is an okay way when we're just working in HTML to load a file. But what we really want to do is load this through what's called a local server. Generally, when you go to websites, you're not going to local files like this, and so browsers will impose some limitations for security reasons on the things that this file can do when it's loaded in the browser. And when you load things over a local server, you don't hit those same restrictions. So we're going to close this. We're not going to really open files this way. What we're going to do instead is use that live server extension to open these. So if I right-click on about.html, I'll see an open with live server. Or if I right-click in my file here, I should also see open with live server down here. These will only show up if you have this installed. What this is going to do is start up a local server. So you can now see that this is no longer a file path. This is an IP address, a port, and then the file about.html. So this is loading a file much closer to how things would be loaded when you actually go to a website. So this is going through a server, so we're not going to hit those same limits. This is generally going to be our process as we get started here, using live server to open our project. You can see down here that there's a new spot, a new thing that's opening up at the bottom that's telling us that we're currently using live server. It's port 550. If I click on this, that will kill the server. And then if I go ahead and try and load this page again, it's going to crash because our server is no longer open on this IP address, our local IP address, and our port. So anytime you're working on this, make sure that you go ahead and open up this project with live server. All right, so let's, now that we've got it loaded, take a look at what we've got and compare it to the code we've written. So we can see that these elements rendered in different ways on the page. So our H1 at the top is the biggest text on the page. It's bold. It says about me, which is kind of what you'd expect a header to do on a page. We have this horizontal rule, which by default is showing up as this break, this line break. We've got an H2, which is slightly smaller in font size than our H1. And then we've got our paragraph, which is even smaller in font size. It is not bold. And then our word together here is emphasized, which by default is showing up in italics inside of our paragraph. So HTML is really about representing the semantics of the content that's on your page, but browsers by default have a set of rules for how these should be styled. So an H1 is styled differently than an H2, and a paragraph is styled differently than both of those. So that's where these differences are coming from, the default styling that the browser is applying. And while we're at it here, let's make a mistake. Let's say I forgot to include the closing tag for my H2. And if I give it a save and run it, we can see that the browser didn't crash. It didn't give us an error, which may be what you're used to from other programming languages. In HTML, the browser is very forgiving and will try to fix mistakes and render as much of the page as it can. So we can see what happened here is that it just assumed that after it got to the name, that H2, that everything was an H2. Oh, you know what? Actually, my formatter kicked in here and automatically added the closing H2. So let me just quickly save this without formatting. We'll talk about the formatters in a second and refresh this page. Okay, so it's doing the same thing that we were seeing before. My formatter just added a closing H2 in there. So you can see it's treating all of this as an H2. So what that means is that when you are debugging your HTML, mistakes that you make in your HTML may not generate errors in your browser. Instead, they may just generate things that look weird. So make sure that if something looks funky on your page, that you go back and check your HTML to make sure that you haven't introduced some error, like you're missing a closing tag or you made a typo somewhere. So let me Control-Z to undo this. And let's quickly talk about formatters while we're at it. And then we'll break down this HTML code. We'll add some new HTML code. So a formatter is something that will take your code and go ahead and run it through a consistent set of rules to turn it into formatted code. So here I'm adding a bunch of white space between my elements. I'm giving it a save, and my formatter is saying, hey, I'm going to collapse all that white space into just a single line. So formatters are really useful because they relieve some of the sort of mental burden that comes with you writing code, where you have to think about formatting your code. By using a formatter, you just hit Control-S, and if you have your Visual Studio set up to save, it'll just format it automatically for you. You won't have to think about how your code should be formatted. So you've installed Prettier, which is a formatter, and then what you want to do is open up the command palette. So Control-Shift-P on Windows, and you want to search for Format Document With. When you click on this, it is going to give you an option for the ones that the formatters you have installed. So there's the HTML language features, which is here by default. There's Prettier, which is the one we've installed. And then you're going to configure default formatter, and you're going to choose Prettier here for HTML files. So when we get to introducing CSS and JavaScript, we'll have to do the same process to make sure that Prettier is the default for those files. So once you have done that, you can go open up the command palette again. So Control-Shift-P on Windows and search for Format Document here. And this will go ahead and format your document using that default formatter. And if you want to take this a step further, which is what I do, if you open up your settings, which is Control, on Windows, you can go ahead and search for Format here to show the settings for formatting. And then this third one here, Format on Save. If you check this, it'll be unchecked by default. That means that every time you save your file, it's going to run through the default formatter. So that means that now, if I go ahead and save after making a bunch of changes, my formatter kicks in and outputs some consistently formatted code. All right, let's go ahead and take a screenshot of this code and then break down some of the syntax that we're seeing here. Bring this over to our whiteboard, paste it in. And we can ignore some of this underlining that's happening here. I have a couple of extensions that are installed. So this one's telling me that I've got something spelled wrong. This one is telling me that we've made a mistake in our HTML, that we actually need more here, that the H1 can't be the first thing. We're going to fix that one in a second, but just ignore them for now. Got this code here. Let's grab my tablet and document this. So an H1 is an HTML element. So is an HR, H2, P. So let me throw that in here, HTML element. And an HTML element is created using tags. So here we have what is called an opening tag for the H1. And this is a closing tag. And then our content goes in between the opening and closing tag for this H1 element. We can also have elements like our HR here, which are self-closing or empty elements. So this means it's an element that has the opening and closing tag basically combined together here. You can see we've got the start with HR that matches our H1 up here, but then it has this closing directly included in it. And you can write this without the slash. My formatter automatically adds the slash in here. Either will work. So this is an element that can't have content placed within it. So we'll see some that are like our header here that have opening and closing, and we'll see some that are empty like HR and image. So got another one here, which is our H2. Same structure with an opening tag and a closing tag. It's just that there's a different thing placed in here for that tag name. Same thing down here. We've got a paragraph, but the additional complication that we've got here is that our M tag, which is an emphasis tag, this is nested inside of our paragraph. So this is a child tag that is inside of our paragraph. And it's really important when you're doing this nesting that the M starts and closes before the parent, this paragraph, closes. So you can see that the M is completely contained within the paragraph because the paragraph starts here and ends here. So we're going to see some more examples of nesting, which will help make that make more sense. But where we're at here is we already understand tags, and we've got a hint of sort of an understanding of nesting. We're going to do some more nesting, and then we'll get to attributes. So let's go back to our code. And one thing that I want to mention is because we're doing a crash course here in HTML, we're just focused on a few HTML elements. So I can't show you every HTML element, but what I can show you is how to read the documentation, which is a really important skill, so that you can find any other element that you might need. So there are a couple of resources for this. If you go to your browser, you can search for W3 Schools HTML reference, and I will have this linked. Or MDN HTML reference, have this one linked as well. Both of these pages have listed out for you all of the HTML elements. So for instance, I can search for H1 here and see that, there's H1 through H6, and they define HTML headings. And there on the W3 Schools, there's a try it yourself button, which gives you gives you an editor on the left-hand side for a file. And then on the right-hand side, a visual representation of that. So the rendered version of that code. So if I hit run, I can see that change. So W3 Schools is a great starting resource for learning HTML elements. And it has this editor, it has a definition, some information on how to use these elements, information on browser support, and then information on attributes, which we'll come back to that when we start introducing attributes. The HTML reference pages are similar. So here I want to go to the element reference page, and I can see a similar thing. So here If I click on H1 through H6, we're going to have another editable HTML file with some CSS in this case and an output over here. And one important thing that I'll point out with this doc is open here, the documentation open here, is that H1, you can think of this as like your outline of your page, or headers, not H1. So H1 through H6, you use kind of like an outline where you use it to organize the content on your page. So you may have a bunch of sections that have an H1 associated with them. That's the title of that section. And then within Beetles, maybe you have a subsection called etymology. You'd use an H2 to represent that. And then, so here we've got an H2 for external morphology. If we have a couple of sections within that H2, we would switch to using H3. So headers, even though by default they change the size of text, you don't really want to use them in that way. You want to use them as more of an outline to organize your page. Okay, so zooming back out, these two references will be really helpful. You will use them anytime you're looking to do something in HTML. So I could go check out like the M tag that we used. It says it defines emphasized text, and here's an example of how to use it. Tells us that it defines emphasized text, and that usually means that it's displayed in italics, and that a screen reader will pronounce that text that's in the M tags using verbal stress. All right, so we're going to keep those handy, and we're going to start building out the rest of our page. And what we're going to deal with is this error that we're seeing here that's telling us that Doctype must be declared first. If I open up this page in the browser, and I open up my developer tools, which you can get to from settings, more tools, developer tools here, Control-Shift-I or F12 is the hotkey to open them on Windows. On Mac, it'll be something slightly different. So here I'm going to hit my hotkey of F12 to open it up, and I'm going to go to this Elements tab. This view up here, which will be over on the left side if your dev tools are wide enough, and if they're shorter, it'll just be at the top. This is showing us what the browser has rendered for the HTML, and if I hover over different elements, it's hovering over them on the page. So you can see that this HTML that the browser has rendered is actually different than the HTML that we gave it, that we saved in this file. And that's because, like we saw with the H2, the browser is doing its best to try and turn our code into something that is well formatted and that is valid HTML. So it's added some things that we omitted. So we're now going to add those in and have a full skeleton here. And we are going to use another text expansion from the Emmet plugin in Visual Studio. If I type exclamation point, that is showing me two Emmet expansions. And if I click on this first one, or if I hit tab, that's going to go ahead and use that expansion to fill in the HTML skeleton. So we're going to see some things like HTML head body that the browser was injecting for us. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this text and I'm going to move it into the body. You can just cut and paste, or in Visual Studio, I'm holding down Alt and hitting the up arrow to bubble that text into my body. And that's the hotkey on Windows. On Mac, the hotkey may be slightly different. So if I save this, not a ton is going to change about our page. So let's break down some of what we have added here. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. So Doctype up at the top here is how we tell the browser what version of HTML we're using. When we just use HTML like this is telling it we're using HTML5, the latest version of HTML. There are other ways to specify past versions of HTML. Then there is an HTML element here, and I can actually collapse these using my sidebar to sort of show everything is in that HTML element. So that's our container for everything in our page. Then we've got head and body. The head is for meta information about that page, not stuff that shows up in the page itself, but that describes resources that the page needs to load, describes the title that should be in the title bar, the icon that should be in the the tab in the bar at the top of the browser. Body is for the actual content of the page. And you can see as I hover over these, it's giving us the information from the MDN reference for each of these elements. So if we just look inside of the head, there are 3 elements in here from the skeleton. There is a char set or character set, which we're saying we're using Unicode 8 here, UTF-8, which is a good default for us to use for our HTML documents. Then we have a meta tag here that describes the viewport to say that we have designed this web page with the width equal to whatever the device's width is and the initial scale equal to 1. This is an important thing when we're starting to think about responsive design. For now, we're just going to kind of include this in our template. And then the title here is what shows up in our tab up at the top here. So you can see as I'm looking at other pages, the title is different. So here, if we wanted to change this from document to something else, like we could throw in, I'm just opening the emoji keyboard, which the hotkey on Windows is Windows period. And I'm going to look for the wave emoji and copy and paste that in a couple times, save it. We can see that that's now showing up in our title bar. So whatever you put in here doesn't show up on the page itself, but shows up at the inside of the tab up here. So that's the head. It's used for meta information about the page. And then our body here is the actual content of our page. So when we're creating our H1s, our H2s, our paragraphs, those go inside the body, not inside of the head. So one thing that we can do with code is introduce a comment. And since this class, you've probably done programming before, you're familiar with comments, but essentially there's something that's ignored by the compiler or the browser, depending on what language you're in, that we use to document our code. So it helps us remember what our code does, helps other developers that we're collaborating with understand what our code does. And in HTML, a comment looks like this. This is the opening of the comment. This is the closing of the comment. You can also hit Control / to insert a comment in Visual Studio, and Control / again to sort of toggle that comment on and off. So for instance, I could move my H1 here if I put my cursor on my H1 and I comment it out. That means that the browser ignores that line of code and our H1 disappears from our page. And if I come back and hit Control / again, that is now re-rendered and shows up on our page. So comments here, let's add in one. This is a comment. And add some white space. It is ignored by the browser when rendering. And you can see that it doesn't, this white space in here, everything is ignored from this start of the comment to this close of the comment. So none of this is showing up anywhere in our page. So we can leave comments here like to explain what some of these tags are. So H1, header of level importance 1, P, paragraph of text, HR, horizontal rule, M, emphasized text. So when we document our code this way, as we're learning, this gives us a little reference so that we can remember what the code we wrote does. When you get into collaborating with other developers, you'll often leave comments that explain what the code is doing, why you wrote code a certain way. Big picture stuff goes in here. You normally wouldn't be like describing the basics of HTML, but this is okay for us as we're learning to annotate our code in this way. While we're at it, let's also talk about white space in HTML. So we've got our comments here, and then if I add a bunch of white space, and because I have my formatter set up to save anytime that or to format anytime I save, I'm going to have to open up my command palette with Control-Shift-P and then say save without formatting to make sure that this saves without going through my formatter. And pull this up, you can see that there isn't a bunch of space between my About Me and my HR, even though I added it in here. So one thing to note about HTML is that by default, it renders white space by collapsing it. So it doesn't matter how much white space we add between, let me save without formatting again, between elements, that whole set of white space here is collapsed down to a single space. Add a little caveat that in CSS, we can control how this white space is interpreted. By default, it's collapsed. And for things like showing code on your web page, if you want to include a code snippet, there are ways to control that to make sure that it doesn't collapse. So let's add a comment here. White space is collapsed by default in HTML. And I don't love this HR anymore, so I am going to use a comment using my hotkey Control// to remove that HR from the page. If you select multiple elements and toggle the comment, it's going to add the comment around those elements. So we can see that I just removed 2 elements successfully by wrapping them in a comment, and then I can uncomment them and bring them back. So comments can be useful for doing this kind of selective testing of elements or selective rendering, temporarily knocking them out from the page and bringing them back. Okay, let's get into nesting a little bit more deeply. So what I want to do is add a comment here to explain that we're going to do a nesting demo. And what we're going to do is display a list of elements on the page. And let's add a paragraph to say some things I've been doing lately. And then we're going to add a list of those things. So like I've been learning to make sauerkraut, cooking, making cold brew. I want to add those in a list. And we could just add them as separate paragraphs here. But there is a HTML element or a set of HTML elements for this. So if I go back to my W3 Schools reference and I search here for list, or actually another way to do this, since list didn't pull up the elements that I'm looking for, if I go on this page and I Control F for list, I can see everywhere where the word list is printed on the page. And so LI is an element that defines a list item, and OL and UL down here are ways that we can create an ordered list using those list items. So let's say we'll do an unordered list here, so a UL unordered list. You can see that it's composed of the unordered list element and then the list item element inside of it. And how this renders by default is with a bullet next to each element. So I'm going to type in UL, hit tab for the emit auto expansion. I'm going to type in LI, hit tab, and say learning to make sauerkraut. LI, cooking my way through a cookbook. LI, making cold brew. And give this a save and check it out in our browser, and we can see we've got our paragraph followed by a bulleted list. And we can also do another one. So let's say some languages I am going to be using. And this time we will do a ordered list. So I'm hitting OL and then tab, LI, HTML. That's what we're doing today. We'll learn CSS in the next video. We will learn JavaScript in the video after that. We'll start learning TypeScript and React later. Don't freak out that we're learning a bunch of languages. We're going to sort of progressively add one. Add them one at a time so that it's not overwhelming. So now the difference here is just that this wrapping element is an OL instead of a UL. And if we check out our browser, we can see those are rendered now using, by default, numbers next to each element. So same deal as our nesting with our emphasis tag is that this UL contains all of our list items. And this list item needs to start and end before the next list item here. Same way that our M here was sort of starting and ending before our paragraph tagged ended. So each element here starts with li, closing, ends with the closing li. And also by default, our formatter is kicking in to add white space to indent the li over. So remember that the white space gets collapsed, so this doesn't really matter in terms of what renders in the browser. This here is for our purposes so that our code is readable. And it is common for your formatter to kick in here and take anything that's nested and indent it over by one. You see the slight difference here with the M. M is intended to be an element that is inline, and list items are intended to be their own line. So that's why our formatter isn't sort of kicking in and pushing this onto a new line tabbed over. And then let's add a comment here to add some terminology. The UL is the parent element and the LI is the child element. That's often how we refer to them, with parent and child. Okay, so we have nesting covered, we've got tags covered. Let's flip back to our whiteboard. The last thing that we want to talk about is attributes. And this is sort of the last fundamental concept of HTML, that if you get, then you basically get all of HTML. So what I want to do is include a hyperlink. So for instance, let's say after my OL here, I'm going to say attributes demo in a comment, and I want to create a paragraph that says an app I use daily is Todoist period. And what I want to do is turn Todoist into a hyperlink that takes folks to the landing page for the to-do app called Todoist. So right now, let's flip back to our browser here. This is just showing up as normal text. If I go back to my HTML reference and I search for A, which is the anchor tag, which also is at the top of the list here, this says that it defines a hyperlink. And if we go check it out, try it ourselves, you can see that the text here is wrapped in an anchor tag, an A tag, and it has this other information inside of the opening tag that is the website that this link takes you to. So it is the href or hypertext reference that is being specified here using what's called an attribute. So let's go ahead here and replicate that. I'm going to create an A, an anchor tag, put my text inside of that, and then my href, I'm going to say takes to https://todoist.com. Give it a save. Come back to the page. Go ahead and click on that. Whoops, let me click on that normally. I middle clicked on that to open it in a new tab. So if I click on it normally, what that does is take me to that new page. And if I go back here to my reference, and now I'm going to scroll down a bit to the attributes section, a hyperlink, like some other elements, has a bunch of attributes that you can specify. So our href here is the URL that the link should take you to, which we saw worked. We've got download and media and ping, rel, target, type, and we're going to use target here to specify where that opened link opens. So if we were to specify that the target is blank, instead of clicking on Todoist and it opening inside of this tab, it is going to open inside of a new tab. So I'm going to come back here and say target equals underscore blank. Give it a save. And now if I click on Todoist, it opens in a new tab. The other thing that the A tag supports is global attributes. So these are just attributes that all elements are allowed to have. And the title is one of those things that gives you more information about that element. So let's try adding that to title equals software recommendation. Give it a save. My formatter kicked in to sort of space this out. And now if I hover over Todoist, that title will show up that says software recommendation. So let's take a screenshot of this and we will bring it back over to our whiteboard to document this HTML element. Let's throw attributes up here. So attributes are the way that we can specify some information about an element. So again, none of this directly showed up on the page. It influenced how this element reacted to interaction on the page. It influenced some of how this hyperlink opened, like with target blank. So attributes we're going to specify inside of our opening tag here, inside of the opening anchor tag. And the structure is that you're going to have an attribute name followed by an equal sign followed by an attribute value. I'm just going to abbreviate attribute here. So we can specify a single one like this. Attribute is href equals this hyperlink in quotation marks. Our attribute values are always going to be in quotation marks. And then if we have multiple, it's important that we make sure that we have a space to separate attributes. So our href equals Todoist, space, target equals blank, space, title equals software recommendation. So then using attributes is just a matter of making sure that you look at the reference, understand what the attribute is supposed to be doing. And some attributes or some HTML elements will have specific attributes that influence them. And then there are also these global attributes that all HTML elements accept. Let's practice this by adding one more element to our page that uses attributes. So let's go ahead and go back to our reference. And what we're going to look for is the img tag, which is an image tag. So we can see that the way that you use it is you pass in some attributes here. So you pass in where the file is located that this image should load, this image element should load, some alternate text, which would be text that screen readers see for this element. And you can also specify the width and height. So what I'm going to do is grab an image that I already have downloaded to my machine. You can grab an image from anywhere for following along. And this is a Creative Commons image that I found online. So what I'm going to do is go into my HTML demo folder here. I'm going to create a new folder called images. And then I'm going to paste my image in here. And you can see that that is also showing up here in my sidebar. So you can see that image, this GIF has been added to my project. So what I'm going to do here is create an image element and say that the source is equal to the path from my about.html file to that image. So this is a relative path. So I'm going to start it with / to tell the browser, start where my about.html is located, and then go into the images folder. And you can see Visual Studio here is helpfully showing me what are options from my current location. So I'm going to images, and then I'm going to go to the file path, and it needs to match exactly here, the name of your file. So if I save this and check it out in my page, we can see that that animated GIF is now loading on the page. If I were to have made a mistake here and like forgot the F in GIF, we're now going to see a broken link showing up here on the page. So that's your hint that you may have made a mistake as you're bringing an image element onto the page here. Let's add an alt, some cool art. And then the width and height are attributes that allow you to control how big that image is. So if I specify a width of 300 and I don't specify a height, what the browser will do is make sure that this respects the aspect ratio of the image, so it doesn't stretch or squash. If I do add a height in here, say a height of 100 pixels, it will squash our image here. So if you're specifying width and height, often you'll only specify one of those to make sure that the browser keeps the aspect ratio and your image doesn't get stretched or squashed. So image, it's another element that you use attributes with. We've got the src for source, the alt for the alternative text, width and height. Same format, the name equals value in quotation marks. And image is also another one of these empty elements, like our HR that we saw at the beginning, that doesn't take any content within it. So I'm going to add a comment here, load an image from a relative URL. So you can also load images using an absolute URL, like we could go find the URL to some image from Google Images and paste it in here. So it starts with HTTPS:/ whatever. That technically works, but generally you want to avoid that on your websites and apps because you're linking to someone else's service. Usually you want to have a copy of that image on your own server, wherever that's hosted. Here this is on our local machine, so we want to have that image downloaded so that we can use a relative URL here. All right, to wrap this up, I want to introduce a couple of elements and also show how to link between pages. So I'm going to head to my index.html. I'm going to use that Emmet expansion to go ahead and expand this up. I'm going to go ahead and change the title to be the wave emoji. Oops. And inside of the body here, let's just put an H1 that says home. So if I go back to my browser, currently I'm at my local server, port 5500/about. If I change this to be index.html, now I'm at that home page. If I change this back to about.html, I am at the about page. And actually, by default, servers are usually configured so that if you don't specify a page, you automatically are directed to whatever is at index.html. Okay, so let's go back to our about.html. And what I want to do is add a header. I'm going to do that. Let's do it below these comments. So a header element is a header like you would create in a doc. It usually has some intro content. You often have one on your page that is your header for that page, but you can have multiple. If you have a section that has its own header, you can have multiple headers on the page. So here, what I'm going to do is create a spot for maybe like a logo for our page, and I'm just going to add a disk emoji. And save this and check it out on the page. We can see that this header is showing up as the first thing on the page. And then let's also add a nav, which is an element that is used to contain navigation. So I can create some hyperlinks here, so some A tags, that point to other HTML pages within my application. So instead of specifying a absolute URL here with https://, I can do a relative URL. So I can say / index.html to go from about to its neighboring file. So this is current directory, look for index.html, and I'll put the word home, drop in a little separator, and do another one, href is equal to /about, and this will be about. Give this a save, and check it out. So we have our hyperlink for home and about, and if I click on home, it takes me to my home page. If I go back, I click on about, it doesn't do anything special because we're already on the about page, but it technically is reloading the page that we're on. So this is our header for the page. We can add a comment here. Header is often used for things like intro content, like navigation, logo, etc. And our nav is used for navigation links. And let's add another comment here to help explain what we're doing, that inside of a nav, you will usually place anchor tags. So this is my header that I want to use for all of my pages. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is grab this header and paste it in above my h1 inside of my body on my index.html page. So that means that if I go to home, I now still have that same content at the top, and I can switch back to about. So I can now go back and forth between multiple pages. Okay, last few things here. Header is your header at the top of your page. Oops, let's fix this typo. Navigation. You often will use a main element to represent the main content of your page. So what I'm going to do is create a main element with an opening and closing tag, and I'm going to grab all of my content here. So this is my H1, H2 paragraph all the way down to my image, and you can either cut or bubble this. So bubbling on Windows is Alt and then the up arrow, so that all of this content is inside of my main tag. So main opens here, closes down here. Give this a save, and you can see that if I collapse this, all that stuff is inside of main. So this isn't going to change anything at how the page looks, but it changes how our page is semantically representing the content. So a screen reader or a bot that's parsing our page would know that all of this is the main content of the page, and all of this is the header content of the page. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and add a footer. So much like header is the header content, footer is your sort of supplemental info. You can have multiple footers on the page. Like if you have sections, each section might have its own header and footer associated with it. Here, we're just going to create like let's do copyright 2021 down at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is check how this renders, and then I'm going to bring it over to my home page. So we can see here, this is rendering at the bottom. It's the last thing we put inside of the body. So I can go back to my index, paste that in, and then I want to make sure that my H1 is in a main element to kind of match the same structure that we were using in our about.html. So if I save that and flip back and forth, we can see that both pages have the same structure with the header and footer. And sort of invisibly, we know that each of these things, all the content on our page is wrapped in that main element. All right, so we finished the sort of basic version of creating a page in HTML here. We learned the basics of what I would consider the fundamentals of HTML, tags, nesting, attributes, and really the rest is just knowing how to use documentation to find the right element for the thing that you're trying to create on your page, and then reading how you use it, like what attributes that element takes. So for instance, if we wanted to get some text input on the page, we would use the input element, and we would have to look through to see like, oh, okay, input elements, they take some attributes like the type, which influences what type of input element it is. So reading that documentation, having that documentation handy is part of the process moving forward, learning more HTML. And what we'll do in future videos, so we'll learn how to format this so that it looks a bit prettier. It's not just using the default styling that the browser applies. And we'll learn how to make this interactive using JavaScript.